Hi, everybody. My name is Krishna Thiagarajan, and I'm coming to you live today from Seattle, Washington. I'm trying to address the question of how we need to change in order to be ready for the future, and I really appreciate the motto of this symposium, which has flexibility written all over it. I'm coming from the viewpoint of an orchestra CEO and what it means for our orchestras and how we have to change, not just because of COVID, but because we're heading into a very different future than the years that we've had behind us. So the new model for a symphony orchestra, and here's a spoiler alert, I truly believe that the values of democracy can and should be included in the new model for a symphony orchestra. And to understand just how much we as an industry of performing arts organizations and specifically orchestras have to change, we really have to understand the origins of how orchestras were born. In the case of the Seattle Symphony, it's an organization that's been around for 123 to 125 years, depending on which of the precursor organizations you count. So think about that. If you go back 125 years, we're not talking about a society that we have today. We're talking about a society that is basically steeped in patriarchy, some form of monarchy or dictatorship. At that time, Europe is really the center of what is supposedly a leading culture. You've got the British Empire, you've got the French Empire, you've got Germany, you've got Russia, and a number of other smaller European countries setting the tone and also setting the definition of what supposedly excellence means in the performing arts. And that structure of leadership, that definition of excellence, has really not changed very much in the legacy performing arts organizations since then. Sure, we've made a number of attempts and we will continue to change, but by and large, very few orchestras moved away from a structure that is basically a patriarchy or some form of authoritarian leadership. You have the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra in the 1980s being formed in New York that works without a conductor and is musician-led and musician-owned. In the 1990s, you have a number of organizations, including most of the large London orchestras, and the Berlin Philharmonic moving to a much more democratized system of ownership and governance for their orchestras. But by and large, American orchestras still function in a very structured way. You have a board that provides wisdom and wealth. You have a music director who is the unchallenged leader on the podium, and you have a CEO and an administrative team that runs the rest of the organization and is usually found itself in loggerheads with a unionized workforce, i.e. the musicians. And all of that, I believe, actually needs to change in order to be ready for the future. And now we get to the challenges that came through COVID. I'd like to explain why I believe these changes are necessary, because there are a number of organizations that got through COVID a little bit better than some of the other organizations that ran things in a much more traditional way, shall we say. So as we head into COVID, we've got two types of organizations: those with a very large foundation, and they have a lot of cushion financially to work through that, and organizations with a very small foundation support, and they don't have a lot of financial cushion. And yet, when we look at orchestras that kept performing, that kept playing, that kept their musicians on payroll, that didn't fire everybody and shut down during COVID, it isn't the wealthiest organizations, but it's an odd mix of some of the organizations with large foundations and some of the organizations with small foundations that kept going. In fact, it's a handful. One of those is the Seattle Symphony, and we are not one of the organizations with the largest foundation. So how did we do it? What created the environment that allowed the Seattle Symphony to have greater tolerance for risk in a very unplannable situation? And how did COVID act as an accelerant for innovation? And is this transferable to other organizations? I absolutely believe, of course, that it is. So the challenge when the organization was faced with COVID and the early shutdowns in 2020 was that we began to realize this is a longer term problem. We also took stock in what we had and what we didn't have. And it's easiest to take stock in what we don't have. And as we head into COVID, we did not have a lot of abundant resources, i.e. money. We did not have a lot of time to react to it. And we also didn't have any experience in how to deal with this particular crisis. On the other hand, we had an in-house unionized orchestra that had already shown that it was working with us in a very collaborative way whenever we had to go to the bargaining table. And that's a great thing, collaborative bargaining rather than adversarial bargaining. We had a philosophy of putting the people's needs first, both inside the organization and also as we serve our audiences and our community's needs. And we had an orchestra committee and myself as CEO and my administrative team that were authorized to work together and to make decisions without any interference. And we didn't have a lot of lawyers at the table either. Sorry, don't mean to offend any lawyers in this audience. We love you, but sometimes it's better to just talk and see what we can figure out, and then later have the lawyers check whether the document checks out. And the most important ingredient, we had full transparency, both of the process and of the results. So here's the challenge that we actually had to overcome in the summer of 2020. We knew we wanted to retain the orchestra and the staff, but we weren't allowed to sell any tickets. So suddenly we had zero earned revenue. So how did we try to work through that? We came up with a strategy of joint financial sacrifice so that everyone could stay on. We knew we needed everyone because we needed their wisdom and expertise. The second step was we wanted to continue serving our audience. And to do that, we also wanted to make sure that the advanced ticket sales that they had given us could stay in-house because we needed that money to have our musicians paid while we were playing for an audience. So we created an online platform for live concerts. And then the challenge of COVID, in a time when vaccine wasn't available, we had to create a safe venue with procedures. We had to update air filtration. We had to work with local hospitals to get their expertise on disease prevention. We had to create cleaning processes, entry and exit protocols, and most importantly, socially distanced concerts and stage performance seating arrangements for an orchestra that was used to playing with 88 to 100 people on stage, suddenly no more than 40 people with great distances, masked, and in some cases we were masked and shielded. And we had to plan repertoire that could be played at those strengths. And then finally, we had to put in place a regular, vigorous testing policy so that anybody who came into the building we knew was healthy and was allowed to come and play. And here's the biggest challenge. We had 6 weeks and we had isolated barely $40,000 to do it with. And we had to buy cameras, set up a control room, set up an online streaming service, and all of that with 6 weeks of notice. Now, when we talk about flexibility and inflexibility, I think I'm making the point that we had to be very flexible and very entrepreneurial in order to get this done. Normally, orchestras do things on 18-month timelines, 2-year timelines, 5-year strategic plans. We had 6 weeks. So how did we actually do it? During the planning phase, we had weekly meetings with our orchestra musician colleagues through the orchestra committee. They moved from being a unionized workforce to being actually regarded as our in-house engineers. I know the Disney Corporation has a term called Imagineers. I don't want to steal that, but our musicians have the expertise of telling us how they can keep making music, even in a non-standard environment, and we needed that expertise. Musicians and staff worked in total partnership to find new solutions. Instead of being branded as labor, musicians really became engineers at the table. I've said this now 2 times because I think it's really important not to think of our musicians as a labor force. They're a lot more skilled than just that. The board-led tech task force that we founded also supported myself and the staff to plan and budget parameters for subscriber acquisition and what success actually means when we have churn of online subscription models. And we were very fortunate in Seattle. We do have tech executives on our board that actually do this for a living. It's interesting because it's a philosophy that did not have a lot of ground in our normal marketing and box office life before, but suddenly we were in the same subscription business for online sales as Netflix or Apple TV. The chair of the orchestra committee, that's our in-house union, actually was in daily contact with myself and as the CEO. And we made the decision to invite him to join the executive committee of the board. That was a trust building measure, but it's also because we wanted to streamline all of the conversations and make sure everybody has the same information instantly so that we can feed in and make good decisions. That was the first time in 123 years that a musician joined the executive committee of the board at the Seattle Symphony. The stagehands were actually being trained to run the cameras. Rather than outsourcing and hiring in new people, which was virtually impossible to do, we again put the people that we had first. And we made sure that we could actually work these things in-house. They became camera operators and video production engineers, and they're pretty good at it at this point. The administration and the orchestra committee was negotiating in record speed. We needed 4 amendments to the musician's contract to allow broadcasting, streaming, recording, and socially distanced performances. And then the artistic planning also had to work at record speed with the orchestra and with marketing on monthly timelines. Keep in mind, previously, normal orchestra bookings are 18 months in advance, preferably 24 months in advance, before you even go to print. Now we were booking content just about 4 weeks in advance for new repertoire and smaller ensemble. The concertmaster and section leaders were willing to step up and lead the orchestra in case we couldn't get conductors in time. So they were going to make this like the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra if they had to. And we actually did have one performance where we didn't have a conductor on hand. Keep in mind, at this time, we couldn't even fly people in necessarily from New York because New York State and Washington State and California had different regulations and required different testing procedures and quarantine measures for people to travel. And so what was the result of all of this? I think the most satisfying part of the result of this is that we had much greater diversity and a much more innovative season than we could have ever planned under normal circumstances. The diversity on stage increased substantially. The first 6 concerts that we played in this online format all had musicians of color either as the conductor or as the composer featured or as the soloist, or in some cases, all 3 in one concert. We kept that up. It was the most diverse season with representation of people of color in the organization's history. And the reason for that is because we sourced our talent locally. We also were able to produce 22 masterworks, which is normal for us, 22 weeks of masterworks, all online from September 2020 until August 2021. We were able to attract 3,000 subscribers and 700,000 viewers worldwide with this platform. That's a significantly larger group of people than we reach with traditional concerts in Benaroya Hall. The financial success was also there. We were able to retain our ticket revenue. Most subscribers allowed for us to simply factor that in, and then they had their subscription model instead of their in-seat experience in Benaroya Hall. We also acquired 1,000 new subscribers, and by the end of the year, we're 20% over the goals set for Seattle Symphony Live, a real success. And weekly 40 musicians performed, stayed healthy and in shape. And that last part of staying in shape as a musician is crucial. I think all of you who are performing musicians on this symposium know if you take a 20-month break, it takes a long time to get back in shape. I mean, we all know if we take a 3-week vacation, it takes weeks before we feel back in shape and want to perform. For us, it was important to keep the skill set fresh and ready so that when we were able to introduce audiences again, like we have for this season, that the orchestra is ready to scale back up instantly. And then the point I made before, we had the highest level of diversity in our conductors, guest artists, and commissioned composers due to the requirement that we had to source our artists locally. This is also a takeaway that I think I want to emphasize. If we want to, and if we are committed to, and we are at the Seattle Symphony, increasing equity, representation, then a local approach is actually going to help us getting there rather than sourcing our artists internationally all the time. The democratization of the decision-making process at the highest levels of our organization, I think that was the key ingredient that allowed everybody to stay together, to stay on payroll, to keep working, and to support the needs of our community through music while staying financially successful and stable. I didn't mention this last part, but we actually were able to achieve financial stability despite COVID last year. And we achieved it at a level higher than anything we had seen 10 years prior to that. There are many orchestras that did the same, but very few that did it while performing. It was a true startup mentality of trying things, failing fast in order to move to better solutions. And in the end, it was the greatest period of artistic and technological innovation in the history of this orchestra. And I believe in order to stay relevant, to stay financially sustainable, and to increase opportunities for people of color on our stages, we have to maintain that mindset going forward and not snap back to the old ways. Thank you very much for listening to me today.